Welcome to Kines 212, Advanced Anatomy and Kinesiology of the Upper Extremity. My name is Jim Herkimer, and I'm going to take you through the next few weeks as we compare the upper extremity with the trunk and lower extremity that we did previously, and get a good understanding of the differences that and the unique opportunities that our upper extremity provides us to get through the day and have a kind of a functional opportunity to do all the things that we need to do. So a couple of things, just to look at when I compare the upper extremity with the lower extremity is our lower extremity really is responding to gravity and ground reaction forces, and so it's much more reactive in its function, where the upper extremity is more intentional in nature. We think about reaching for something or grabbing something or having a drink of a coffee. So it looks at things or we need to look at things from a little bit different perspective, although we will draw some comparisons. So sit back and enjoy the lectures, and remember to go in depth in the textbook, so that we can draw upon a complete understanding of the upper extremity. The wrist and hand, together with the joints of the shoulder and the elbow, complete a series of articulations that allow effective functioning of the upper extremity. Some sociologists have talked about the hand as being the expression of power and the expression of will, and some even have said that while our brain is responsible for civilization, the hand is what allowed it to be built. So we're going to take a look at anatomy and both skeletal and muscular anatomy, and then take a look at a view of what makes some of the things specific about this incredibly ingenious appendage that we have that allows us to grip and move and function in our daily lives, and we oftentimes kind of take it for granted. I will often use the joke, what's the difference between humans and zebras, and the difference being that well, humans have thumbs, and that little thumb provides an incredible difference in allowing us to function like very few other mammals on the earth. So let's take a look at some skeletal anatomy and muscular anatomy, and we will then proceed into function. Our wrist consists of two compound joints, the radial carpal joint here and the mid-carpal joint here. These joints combined create what we can call the wrist complex. And each joint of the wrist complex serves to really broaden the function of the entire upper extremity. So our shoulder and elbow are responsible for placing our hand in space in the right spot, but our wrist is responsible for smaller finite movements that create appropriate length tension relationships in the finger flexors and the finger extensors that allow fine motor control, that improve your ability to write a sentence or pick a penny up off the ground. So let's take a look at the bones and review our anatomy and get a better understanding of some of our bony attachments and landmarks that we need to be able to identify. So when I look at the radius here, we can see that as the distal aspect is a single continuous biconcave surface, medial-lateral, and which is longer, deeper than it is anterior posterior, which is also concave in nature. There's a lateral radial facet which articulates with the scaphoid. There's a medial articular facet which articulates with the lunate. And there is the articulation between the radius and the ulna, where the triangular fibrocartilage complex, which primarily articulates with the triquetrum, but also has some contact with the, which also has some contact with the lunate. Now, the radial ulnar disc, which is a component of the, again, of the TFCC, or the triangular fibrocartilage complex, also serves as part of the distal radial ulnar joint. So when I look at the whole compound, the whole complex, that disc creates the articulation which the ulna and the radius articulate around in pronation and supination. When I look at the ulna, we have a styloid process, and it is primarily articulating with the pisiform, and again as part of that that disc. Ligamentous, I've got the dorsal radial carpal ligament and the dorsal intercarpal ligaments, and when I move around to the palmar aspect, I have the palmar radial carpal ligament here and here, and the palmar radial ulnar ligament. So looking at the articulation of the proximal row on the proximal row of carpals, we start with the scaphoid and move ulnarly towards the ulnar side to the, and I'm going to have to hide some of these ligaments to get them out of the way here, to the lunate, to the triquetrum, and the pisiform. So that makes up the proximal row, starting with the trapezium to the trapezoid, capitate, and the hamate. And a couple of specific components that we need to look at is the hook of the hamate, which articulates via ligament with the pisohamate ligament, which helps to support, maintain that articulation with the pisiform, which is essentially a floating bone. When I move distally, I have the 5 metacarpals, starting with the thumb being the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth. Going to the phalanges, which would be the proximal and distal phalanx of the first, and the proximal, middle, and distal phalanx of the second through the fifth. So that's the bony articulations that provide the stability of the hand. And a couple of things of note. When I look at this, articulation, I can see a nice tunnel that's created from an osseous tunnel that's created. And we're going to come back and talk about the carpal tunnel here in a minute, and what structures go through the carpal tunnel. So let's take a look at let's take a look at the muscles that control the intrinsic and the extrinsic muscles that control finger function and wrist function. So let's take a look at muscles and see if we can identify why the intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of the hand are so important for positioning our hand and gripping and grasping. And there are essentially 6 muscles that have of the extrinsic flexors that have tendons that cross the palmar aspect of the wrist, and there's 9 muscles that have tendons that cross the dorsum of the wrist. And all the extensor tendons are deep to the extensor retinaculum, whereas on the palmar surface that's not entirely true. So the first one we want to take a look at is the Palmaris Longus. And when I look at the Palmaris Longus, we can see it highlighted here, and its origin is on the medial epicondyle of the humerus, and it courses down to insert into the palmar aponeurosis and the flexor retinaculum. Innervated by the median nerve, it flexes the hand and tenses the flexor retinaculum. And what we'll find in part of the population is that they are people that don't have this muscle, and some people will only have it on one side, and some people have it on both sides. So one of the things that you can kind of look at, party favors, is to look and compare how many people have that tendon. So you have them make a cup shape in their palm of their hand and see if they can see if you can identify that tendon. So when I move a little bit towards the radial side, so when I move towards the radial side, I have the flexor carpi radialis, and it is a superficial muscle of the anterior compartment of the arm, attaching at the medial epicondyle of the humerus at that common flexor attachment. It inserts into the base of the second metacarpal and the base of the third metacarpal, innervated by the median nerve, and we'll find that it flexes the wrist and abducts towards the radial side of the hand. As I move down into the depth of the wrist flexors, I have the Flexor Digitorum superficialis, which again has an attachment on the humeral head, medial epicondyle, ulnar head, cornoid processes. So this has a big attachment, and you can see this large attachment coming all the way across. And it inserts into the middle phalanx of the second through the fifth. So we can see that it divides into 4 tendons that have a common attachment, and we're going to come back and visit this unique attachment as we look at the fingers and there start to appreciate how complex the finger flexor and extensor mechanism is. And we'll come back and visit the brachioradialis with the wrist, or with the elbow. The flexor palmaris longus has an origin on the surface of the radius in the interosseous membrane, so it's a fairly deep muscle. It inserts into the base of the distal phalanx of the thumb. So we can see that it courses through the carpal tunnel to insert into the base of the thumb, innervated by an interosseous branch of the median nerve, and it flexes the distal phalanx of the thumb. The Flexor Digitorum profundus is a finger flexor that originates on the proximal 3/4 of the anterior and the medial surface of the ulna and the interosseous membrane. So if we come up and we can see its attachment along the interosseous and the upper aspect of the ulna, and then inserts into the base of the palmar surface of the distal phalanx of 2 through 5. Now, this is what's kind of interesting. The superficialis comes down and attaches on the splits and attaches under the middle phalanx. This tendon runs all the way through and attaches distally. So the superficialis and the profundus are the two primary finger flexors that generate the greatest power in gripping. So it flexes the wrist and flexes the fingers. And then our last flexor is the flexor carpi ulnaris. And if we move this around a little bit, we can see that it attaches on the medial epicondyle of the humerus, or excuse me, the medial epicondyle, the humerus, and on the olecranon of the ulna, and courses down to insert into the pisiform and the hook of the hamate and the base of the metacarpal, of the fifth metacarpal. So it's innervated by the ulnar nerve, which is different than most of the other wrist flexors, which are median nerve innervations. Flexes the wrist and adducts the hand, so we get ulnar deviation in addition to wrist flexion. So those are the wrist flexors that are associated with the extrinsic muscles. So let's take a look now at the wrist extensors. And our wrist extensors have kind of a common attachment along the lateral, the common extensor tendon. So we start with the extensor carpi radialis. And the extensor carpi radialis longus originates on the lower third of the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus, inserts into the dorsal surface of the base of the second metacarpal. So as I come down, we can see that it inserts into the base of the second metacarpal, innervated by the radial nerve, and it extends and abducts the wrist. So it works in conjunction with the flexor carpi radialis for radial deviation, in addition to wrist extension. So the extensor carpi radialis brevis, lateral epicondyle of the humerus, on the common tendon, innervated by the radial nerve, and inserting into the base of the third metacarpal bone. So brevis into 3, longest into 2. The extensor digitorum, originating on that lateral epicondyle of the humerus, again by that common extensor tendon, and inserting into the dorsal expansion of digits 2 through 5, innervated by the deep radial nerve, responsible for extension of the wrist and extension of and abduction of fingers 2 through 5. The extensor digiti minimi, originating off the common extensor tendon, and then inserting into the distal phalanx of the fifth finger. And this allows extension and abduction of the wrist, and extension of just the fifth. So we do have a muscle that goes just to the fifth, which is the extensor digiti minimi, and we have one that goes just to the first. But before we get there, let's get this last one off, this common attachment, which is the extensor carpi ulnaris. Again, off of the common attachment, inserts into the tubercle on the ulnar side of the base of the fifth metacarpal. So if I turn this around and bring it up a little bit, we can see its attachment into the base of the fifth metacarpal, providing extension and ulnar deviation. Abductor pollicis longus, originates in the lateral dorsal surface of the radius and the ulna and part of the interosseous membrane, courses down under the extensor retinaculum and inserts in the radial side of the base of the first metacarpal bone, innervated by the deep radial nerve, and it provides abduction of the wrist and the thumb. Then we have the extensor pollicis longus, originating from the lateral part of the middle third and the dorsal surface of the body of the ulna and the interosseous membrane, coursing down to insert into the distal aspect of the distal phalanx, innervated by the deep radial nerve, and it extends the thumb and helps to abduct or radial deviate the wrist. And then the extensor pollicis brevis, originating on the dorsal surface of the body of the radius, inserting into the base of the proximal phalanx of the thumb, and it extends the thumb and abducts the wrist. And then lastly, the extensor indicis, originating on the posterior surface of the ulna and the interosseous membrane and inserting into the distal phalanx of the second finger, and it's responsible for extension of the wrist and an extension of all the joints through the second finger. So it's, that's that our muscle responsible for allowing us to point our finger at people. Okay, so that's the muscular and skeletal arrangement in the wrist and hand, and we'll come back and start looking at the carpal tunnel and functional anatomy, functional movement of the hand in the next module.